for people to join the session, please do use the chat if you'd like to introduce yourself, so we know who's in the audience today. And also to say that we'll, as we're going through the talks, be great if you could use the Q&A function at the bottom here of the screen to ask questions of the panel. And we'll just wait a minute or two before we get started. So welcome to those who are joining. We're just going to wait a minute for the numbers to increase a little bit more, and then we'll get started. In the meantime, do introduce yourself in the chat so we know who's out there today for this early career session. As I say, we'll just wait a minute or so. We'll be live tweeting during the session, but please do also tweet yourselves if you'd like to share. And I think we've put the hashtag in the chat for you. So hashtag ECR lunchtime and hashtag VAM webinar, and do tag us at as well. Great. Okay, so it looks like our numbers are increasing, and I think we'll make a start. So we can make the most of the session. So again, very warm welcome. My name is Dr. Helen Fisher. I'm based at King's College London, and I'm part of the UKRI Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network. And we're together with the UKRI, other UKRI mental health networks, we're putting on this series of early career researcher lunchtime sessions on different topics we think are really important for early career researchers to learn about, particularly in current times where it's really important to engage and think about our careers when there's so many difficult things happening out there. So today's session is about engaging with policy, again, a really key aspect of current times. And we've got 5 fantastic speakers with 4 presentations to give you some slightly different perspectives on how to engage with policy from both the policy perspective and the research perspective. So we're going to have our 4 presentations. There'll be about 15 minutes each, and then we're going to have about 20 minutes at the end to answer some questions from the panel. So please do, as we're going along, if you want to introduce yourself or put in links, please do use the chat. If you'd like to ask a question to the panel, please do post it in the Q&A function, which is just at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And at the end, I'll pull those together and put those to the panel, and we'll hopefully answer some of your questions. Great. All right. So let's kick off with our first speaker. So we first got Dr. Claire Wilson, who's a psychiatry specialist registrar and a clinical researcher in the section of women's mental health at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London, and also the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. And she's going to talk a bit about researchers engaging with the UK Parliament, and particularly drawing on her experiences of working as a research fellow in the UK Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. So I'll hand over to you, Claire. Off you go.
Thanks, Helen, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me along to speak to you today. Angela's kindly agreed to share my slides. Thanks very much, Angela. You can go to the next slide. I'm coming to you from an NHS facility that does not have Zoom, hence why I thought it'd be easier to just get Angela to share the slides, so thank you. So I'm going to cover all of these things in the slides today, a very, very quick whistle-stop tour. And I want to acknowledge the Knowledge Exchange Unit at the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. for providing these slides and allowing me to share them with you today. And if you want a copy at the end of the seminar today, I'm happy for you to have them. I'm happy for you to share them. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I'll give you an overview of Parliament, what they do, and how you can get involved, talking a bit about what I did as a research fellow at Parliament. So the UK Parliament, very briefly, there's the House of Commons, there's the House of Lords, and there's the Queen. Next slide, please. And what does the UK Parliament do? Many things. It's composed of elected officials, and it oversees and holds the government to account for what they do. Next slide, please. So here is what the UK government does. So they are appointed by Parliament and run various public departments and have various functions. And if you do ever interview for anything at Parliament, one of the questions I was asked was, what's the difference between Parliament and government? Which I answered very badly, and it was probably one of the reasons they gave me the fellowship, because they realised how little I knew. But yeah, essentially, Parliament is the MPs, it's elected folk, and then government action a lot of what Parliament want them to. Next slide, please. So here's some of the differences. Essentially, the government are accountable to Parliament. As I say, I'm going through these very quickly. Feel free to have a look at them in your own time. Next slide, please. And there are also governments in the devolved administrations. Next slide, please. And there are various ways in which research is used by the UK Parliament, and I hope by kind of giving you a flavour of some of these things, it can stimulate you to think about how, as a researcher, you can influence policy within the UK Parliament. So I'm going to touch on these different bodies. Some are within the House of Lords, some are within the House of Commons, and some are cross-cutting across both houses. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think is quite important for researchers to know about are the select committees. So as I say, you get ones that belong to the House of Commons. So for example, for many of us on the call today, the Commons Health and Social Care Committee, which is currently chaired by Jeremy Hunt, is a relevant one to know about. There's also a Lords Committee of Science and Technology. And what these select committees do is they commission various inquiries on specific topics. So they decide that they're interested in something, and they put on their website online, they say, we're doing an inquiry into X, Y, and Z. And there's various ways in which researchers can feed into these inquiries. So one is, if they're very lucky, they may be invited to give oral evidence. So the select committees hold sittings where they invite experts along to talk to them about what's happening in a particular area. Not that likely for us as early career researchers necessarily to be invited to do those, but you of your own volition can provide written evidence. So select committees will have a window for specific inquiries whereby they will collect written evidence from individuals or organisations on the topics of these inquiries. Suffice to say, important to have a look around, look at select committees in your area, see what kind of inquiries they have, and you can submit evidence. So that's one way that you can impact as a researcher in Parliament. Next slide, please. So yeah, I've kind of alluded to this. Follow the relevant ones on Twitter, go online, have a look, have a browse about what's going on. Next slide, please. Yeah, and you know, this isn't about how do I write for a policy audience, but this slide is giving you some hints and tips. I mean, it's about making it, you know, understandable for anyone, you know, non-expert in the area to understand, keeping it clear and easy to read. Next slide, please. I'll let you again go back, have a look at some of the points on that slide in your own time. There are also libraries in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and I guess they're a bit different from your typical library, and there is not just published research that you would get in a traditional literature database, but it's also records of everything that's ever been discussed in Parliament ever. So often MPs or peers or other folk in Parliament will go to the libraries and will say, can you get me information on X, Y, and Z? Next, please. Thanks, Angela. There is also this other body in Parliament called POST, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. And they decide that they want to produce briefings for parliamentarians on a variety of issues pertaining to science and technology. And that's who I did this 3-month fellowship with, which was in the autumn. I applied to it. So there's various ways you can apply for one of these fellowships at POST, but the way I applied to it was because I was funded by the MRC, I was eligible for a UKRI, which the MRC is part of, funded policy internship. And I was charged with producing a briefing, so a 4-page report for parliamentarians on the mental health of NHS workers during COVID-19. So as a psychiatrist, that was quite interesting for me. And so that involved speaking to stakeholders, reviewing the literature, and is a bit different in that obviously there are different strands of evidence that can inform policy. And I think as researchers, we often tend to think about that hierarchy of evidence, and actually, you know, if it's not published in peer-reviewed in a peer-reviewed journal, then it's not evidence. But actually, you realise that for policymakers, Joe Bloggs in the Street's opinion is actually just as valid as a publication in a journal. So that takes a bit of getting used to. You also learn how to write for a policy audience. And so it was really useful. It was a really useful experience. So, you know, I'd encourage you to look at these fellowships. As I say, there are various ones that get advertised. Go onto the POST website, see what's being offered. You don't just have to be UKRI funded to do these. So that's POST. They produce a lot of these policy briefings essentially on issues pertaining to science and technology. They're another good one to follow on Twitter, and they're another good one to have a look, see what kind of briefings they are currently producing, and look and see, you know, is it in an area that you research in? Is there a paper that you've written that could possibly inform one of these briefings? Send it to them. Similarly, propose a topic for a briefing. Next slide, please. So I've kind of alluded to some of this again. Yeah, I think I've mentioned all of that already. Next slide, please. Legislation. I mean, I'm not going to go into this too much, but essentially, there are various ways in which policy is filtered down and eventually becomes law. And I think when you do get a little bit of a flavour of what goes on at Parliament, you start to see how research can ultimately influence policy and legislation. Next slide, please. So, I've given you ideas about some of this already, and we'll summarise this again at the end. But it's about having a look around, seeing what is currently happening in Parliament. So one of the things that I've done since doing that fellowship is just taking 5 minutes at the beginning of the week to see actually what is the parliamentary calendar, what's going on, what's happening in the Lords and the Commons over the next week. So for the VAMHN network, obviously the thing that's probably quite interesting for many of us at the moment is the domestic abuse bill. That's going on at the moment. So, have a look. When's that being heard? What's being discussed? And tune in to Parliament TV. If you're too busy during the day, you can play it back later on. Parliament TV has got everything live streaming all the time. So, this is all just interesting stuff to be aware of what's going on. Next slide, please. Now, another interesting way of getting involved is the APPGs. So these involve parliamentarians from different parties, and also members of the public, third sector organisations. And I kid not when I say there is an APPG for pretty much every topic that's going. There is an APPG for cats. There is literally one for everything. So I'd be surprised if there isn't one in your area of interest. Again, you can find a list of APPGs on the Parliament website. They often hold meetings that are open to the public, and they should be open to the public anyway. And they are, again, another way of getting involved in potentially quite niche areas in which you might be an expert. And as I say, decision makers go to them. Folk who are involved in making policy go to these APPGs. So they are a great way of getting involved. Next slide, please. As I say, individual members interface with all of these various bodies that I've just been talking about. So you really can influence the decision makers. Next slide. I mentioned the fellowship that I did at the Post. Particularly the knowledge exchange unit, who are based in the Post and who let me use these slides. They offer fellowships as well. So have a look and see what's available. Not everyone has the time to do that. And I've given you other ways that you can get involved. But just in that 3-month fellowship that I did, it gave a really good insight. And I'd encourage anyone to take that opportunity if you have it. Next one, please. So again, some ideas of folk to follow on Twitter. As I say, the knowledge exchange unit. Go onto their website, join their mailing list, because they offer training for researchers. I mean, you've just seen the slide deck now, but they do offer other forms of training as well. And if you can get on their mailing list, it's a great way of learning a bit more about some of this stuff that I've only just very briefly given you a flavour of. Next slide, please. There's a slide there if you are specifically interested in the devolved administrations. The Scottish folk are actually really helpful. I contacted them when I was doing my policy briefing. Next slide. So yeah, some final tips just to summarise at the end. I feel like some of these are fairly grandiose for early career researchers. So I actually made my own summary list. I mentioned have a look at the Parliamentary Calendar, see what's going on, follow various folk on Twitter, get on the Knowledge Exchange Unit's mailing list, have a look at APPGs. Is there one of interest? Can you join their mailing list? Can you go to some of their meetings? Have a look at what the Post are doing in terms of policy briefings, and also what the select committees are interested in. Do you have a paper that you can get cited in something that could potentially shape policy? And finally, if you've got the time, is there a fellowship that you could do in Parliament? I definitely recommend Post, the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. I think that's me. So I will end there. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Claire. Really appreciate you joining us, particularly when you're busy in clinic.
No problem.
Today. So thank you so much. And I know you're going to have to rush off, so you won't be here for the Q&A, but if people do have questions related to Claire, do put them in the chat. We'll try and answer them in the panel, and if not, we can always follow up.
Yeah, and I'm happy for people to have my email address. Sorry that wasn't in the slides, but if anyone wants
do you want to maybe put it in
the
the chat before you go, if you get a chance?
Feel free. I'll put it in the chat before I go. All right, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Really great overview of all the different ways you can engage, particularly with the UK Parliament, and we'll pick up on some more of those during the session as well, which is great. All right, so let us move on to our second presentation, And we're going to have 2 speakers for this, which we're incredibly lucky to have. So we've got Dr. Benedict Wilkinson, who's Director of Research at the Policy Institute at King's College London, and Dr. Vivian Moxham Hall, who's a Research Associate also at the Policy Institute. And they're going to be talking to us a bit about how policy institutes and other types of units at universities can really help researchers within those universities to engage with policymakers. So I'll hand over to Ben and Vivian.
Thanks, Helen. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm going to share some slides, all being well. Also should say thanks to Claire, who's successfully covered quite a lot of the ground that we're going to as well. So you're going to get some of this twice, which is great. And I'm really pleased to be joined by my colleague, Viv. So just a quick introduction. Yeah, I'm Ben Wilkinson. I'm Director of Research at the Policy Institute. I helped establish the Policy Institute at King's in 2013, and I have been Director of Research there for the last 18 months. And I've done lots of sort of trying to influence kind of policy. This is mainly focused on the UK, and as a sort of sideline, one thing that is useful to look at is most universities have an impact acceleration account funded by the ESRC, and there are funds there to do a lot of impact activities. Viv, do you want to quickly introduce yourself as well?
Yep, happy to. I work with Ben at the Policy Institute. I'm a researcher there, so I'm also an early career researcher. I finished my PhD in 2019, feels like an age ago now. But I did my postdoc in Australia and then scooted over here to work with the Policy Institute. But in a previous life, I was also working at New South Wales Health, which is an Australian government organisation, as a policy officer there. And I'll be talking you through the back end of this presentation. So we're just going to tag team. Thanks, Ben.
Great, thanks, Viv. Brilliant. Yeah, so this presentation falls basically into 2 halves. One is a little bit about the Policy Institute and ways of influencing policy, and then in the second half we've got some kind of tools that you might want to think about using. There are many communication tools and a good way of influencing. But I guess that we wanted to start off, in good communication fashion with some key messages. And I think the first and most important is that you can influence policy with research and evidence, and there are ways of designing that into your research from the beginning. The second point, it's not rocket science, and this is true. That some of this, government is ready to have information fed into it. But the third point, it can also be messy and complicated, and requires a set of kind of soft skills that universities aren't necessarily focused on developing in early career researchers or in them as a staff. Much more focused on research skills rather than soft negotiation skills and so on. So it requires a few things that you might have to sort of work on a little bit. Success is not guaranteed, so you can put effort into this and not make progress, but you do need to. We're always trying to encourage people to stay positive, resilient, and optimistic, because in point 5, research really does make a contribution to society, to policy making. It will happen, so keep on plugging away. Those are the kind of key bits that I wanted to raise up front. What are the barriers? What are the problems? I think it's really useful just to focus in why evidence and research don't influence policy more. And Catherine Oliver, who's at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, did a review of this back in 2014. She's now one of the Area of Research Interest Fellows in Parliament, and we can talk a bit about that later. And she basically looked at a systematic review, and found 5 barriers. So one is the availability or access to research is often seen to stay in the ivory tower rather than getting out into the wider world. The second barrier was a lack of, I think clarity is probably a little less fair nowadays, but relevance, I think, is the most important. Research questions seem to be removed from policy questions, and that's a really important point we'll come back to later. Timing, point number 3. Often policymakers want an answer, yesterday, and research takes longer to come up with the right answers. A fourth one, which is very rarely focused in on, is actually that policymakers often are not great at distinguishing between what's really good research, what is mediocre research, and what is bad research. They're not very good at understanding it. It's not trained researchers, and so they find it difficult to engage with it. And then finally, costs. Research can sometimes seem to be quite expensive. So in the Institute, we've boiled this down to three T's, as we call them. We've got translation, trust, and timing. So the translation point is that research is often written in a language that can be fairly inaccessible. Trust, policymakers don't always trust academics, and they don't always trust the answers, and they don't trust the evidence. And then finally, timing. It's often seen to be too late. So these three T's are what drive us in the Policy Institute at King's. And based on those three T's, we designed the Policy Institute at its foundation to effectively have or target those three things. So obviously we're academics, we've got PhDs and so on, so we favour robust, rigorous research. That's the academic side of it, but we have the kind of links of a think tank, and that's meant to build up trust. We try to be as quick as a consultancy, and that's the timing bit. And then the translation bit is that we really favour high quality message-led communications that make research very available, very easily accessible, and timely for policymakers. And for those of you who are not at King's, most universities have structures a bit like ours. So they're sometimes structured slightly differently, but this is kind of the way that the kind of sector is going, if you like. We thought it'd be useful to have a little table that looks at ways into policy, and Claire's really helpfully covered off lots of these, and I know that some of the others will, but I just wanted to throw out a few that it's worth knowing about, which, so Claire mentioned APPGs, which I think are really, really useful. She's absolutely right. They cover a huge range of areas, everything from cats through to cancer. And what they show really is the sort of sideline interest that loads and loads of MPs have, and will be willing to be contacted about. And that's how I've used it in the past. So basically as a register of what given MPs are interested in, and where you kind of need to be focusing some of your searches. So they're really useful. Have a look at the list, because each one has a list of the people who are involved, and you can get in touch with them. The second one I thought would be useful to have a little bit on is about policy windows, and Claire touched on this. It is really useful to have a think about what kind of topics are live for the government at the moment, when they've got reviews and consultations and calls for evidence open. Those means that something is going to happen, and it's worth watching that process and trying to kind of inveigle yourself into it. And the third one that Claire didn't mention, I don't think, are these ARIs, which are the areas of research interest. Now, every government department mapped these out over the last couple of years. You can see their priority questions, and that's a really good way of working out whether your research and what you're working on chimes with kind of where the policy direction is going in a given department, the things that they think they don't know and want to know more about. It gives you a very good kind of window or access point into government departments as well as into Parliament, because there are two different areas. You can focus on Parliament on the one hand, but you can also focus on government and officials on the other. And officials, when they start doing early thinking, will often include questions in their areas of research interest. So we will send these slides around afterwards, all sorts of stuff that Claire's already mentioned, but I do recommend also having a look at those areas of research interest. One passing thing, secondments, as Claire mentioned, also great things to do, and those universities which have impact acceleration accounts will almost certainly have funding for them as well. A very good thing to look at. So what are our top tips? I think these are a bit more sort of strategic ones. My most important thing is co-production is the best way of getting policy impact. So trying to work with policymakers to shape your question, to shape your research findings, and to make them relevant for policymakers is critical. And related to that, if you can engage with them early in your research, even as you're shaping your research questions, making sure that they chime with priorities, concerns, and so on in given departments or in Parliament, then that will really help things happen. And this whole thing that you've got to do it early, if you've got your research findings and you're trying to sort of paint impact on at the end, it's very difficult. But if you can engage early, your chances of influencing are much higher. And then the third point, good communication of your research is really vital. And we're about to give you a whole set of tools that you might be able to use. And hopefully, you can take some of those away. They're all very accessible, all very usable. And I think that's probably the third thing. Make sure you communicate your research so that policymakers who are pretty time poor can access it really easily. And I'm going to pass over to Viv for that, other than to say we're here and we can help. So do get in touch. Over to you, Viv. I'll move the slides for you.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the different channels, different mechanisms that we would use to engage with policymakers. So when we're thinking about defining our impact, what we really want to look at is how, like, the different context communities and constituents, that's sort of looking at that policy window, how you want to aim your policy impact, which is just sort of what Ben ran through. But some of the channels, we've got like 7 different channels that we often use at the Policy Institute. One of them is slide decks. I've actually been using them very frequently lately. So there's a little screen grab here of coronavirus and trust in the pandemic. So we've been working on misinformation and how misinformation impacts on people's perceptions of COVID, especially around vaccinations. And so when we put together all of the information and the polling, we can put all of this out in a slide deck. So it's very ideal for quick turnover. It's good for high-level decision makers because they can see everything in a clear slide. Very easily picked up by the media. We get a lot of media interest in these types of presentations. It's easy to interpret. Obviously, when you have something that's easy to interpret, it can then be seen as an oversimplification. And it also has to be quite novel for the media to bite, because if you're putting out a slide deck, it's just something that's very new, it's very novel, and you just want to get it pushed out very quickly. So this wouldn't work for every type of policy impact or output. So a second, it's also a high intensity, short period of time. So a second channel is something we call policy pamphlets. So they're accessible, they're message-led publications. They enable the reader to understand the research and implications without the in-depth and impenetrability of some academic journals. We like to use these because they're quite quick to turn over. They're good to engage policymakers. You can put something on it gives something tangible you can put on a desk and raises the media profile. But it's also quite time consuming to put together a really comprehensive pamphlet, and you need an outlet to be able to circulate them. Another channel is briefing notes, shorter than a policy pamphlet, similar. So they're around 1,000, 2,000 words. They spell out all of the key findings. Again, they're really good for time poor, high level decision makers. Gets it on their desk, really easy to read. It takes a little bit of attention to detail to try and get it really accessible for both policymakers and for the media. Again, this can oversimplify complex research. That's, I think, something that we endlessly have to deal with when we're working in policy translation, which can often lead you open to criticism, but it's just a nice, quick way to engage policymakers. So our fourth channel, steering groups, meetings. This is a great way to involve people with influence and interest. You can get key stakeholders, giving an early insight into your research, can champion it, they can snowball it. It helps understand challenges to implementation on impact pathway, but it does require a lot of commitment from potentially and very important busy people, because they have to set aside time to be a part of a steering group meeting. But I mean, by them championing it and getting involved in setting aside that time, it can also mean that they're more invested in that policy decision. So these are often good sort of for those issues that have like a policy window, for example. Our fifth channel is working groups or roundtables. Again, it involves key stakeholders putting in a bit more of a time commitment, but again, it also gives an early insight into your research. They can champion it, and and you can get that buy-in because they're engaging in the networks and they're engaging in like the stakeholders and what the issue is. So that's quite good. We also have policy labs. I think that's one that the Policy Institute is very well known for. So a policy lab is often a pre-COVID times, one-day workshop. We had everyone coming in together, meeting and bringing together research and expertise to discuss and make progress on the use of evidence to inform policy. So it often engages stakeholders, it engages policymakers, depending on who you invite to the policy lab. And it's a great way to help understand challenges to implementation and impact pathways. So policy labs can be time consuming to organise. They do take a bit of a run up. So it involves getting a lot of the background information. You're doing research briefings for all of the stakeholders. You have to make sure you have the right people coming along. The better the mix, the more likely you're going to get a positive and very productive meeting. But it can really help tackle some of the really important challenges in policies. So you have like those very tricky issues that you can't sort out in a briefing note, you don't have a simple answer to. But if you have the right question, you can really use a policy lab to nut out a solution. It takes a day, but then you have all that buy-in and you have stakeholders who can really vocalize because they've come up with that solution themselves, that solution to the broader community. So it's a really good tool that we have. One simple one that you've probably all heard of before, and it's just our last little channel that we're just quickly running through with you today, is infographics. So obviously we've seen infographics before. They're a great visual way to communicate messages. You can get them out very easily, very simply. They're tweetable, they're shareable on social media, and you can really see the information in one simple visualization. One issue is that it can be costly because you have to have people who know how to put together infographics, and it also needs to be complemented with some sort of context. So you can't just have one single infographic that stands alone. It's always good to have a bit of a backup. So this is just a bit of a whirlwind of 7 very key top channels that we work with in the Policy Institute and that we can help you with if you wanted to get some impact from your policy. And just circling back to sort of what Ben was saying earlier, some of the top tips from our experience, it's just reinforcing that co-production is key. So working with others, a lot of these channels really do engage policymakers or key stakeholders in getting on board with the process of championing your policy or coming up with a solution to the policy question that you have. It's also engaging with policymakers early. So some of these are really about just providing an insight into what type of policies we're looking at and how we're looking at making sure that there's a solution to them. So if you engage with policymakers earlier, you can get them on board, you can get them involved in your research, and that can also help the research based in the experiences of what's needed. Also, just good communication of your research is vital, and we're here to help. So thank you. Did you want to add anything, Ben? That was very, very quick.
No, that's great. Thanks, Viv.
Fabulous. Thank you both so much. So much information in there. And just to reiterate, we'll have the slides available on the VAMHN website. Put the link in the chat, but we'll send it around again later as well. So we'll have the recording and all the slides where people are happy to share them there. But thank you so much, Ben and Viv. Just amazing amounts of tips and information. Thank you. And just a reminder to people, do feel free if you've got questions that occur to you as people are speaking, please do put them in the Q&A box. You'll see the Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom. Please do add those. And I see we've got one already that we'll already come back to when we get to the panel discussion. Great. But we'll move on now to our third presentation. And it's an absolute pleasure to have today Alistair Love, who's been working as a clerk in the House of Lords since September 2018 and worked in various select committees and offices related to the UK and EU parliaments, and is currently on the Communications and Digital Select Committee. And he's going to talk to us a bit about his role in those committees and how researchers can engage better with them. So I'll pass over to you, Alistair. Thanks for coming along.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you to everyone for having me today. As mentioned, I'm the clerk to the Communications and Digital Select Committee in the House of Lords, and especially Claire's presentation early was a very helpful introduction to Parliament and touched on the role of select committees. So my previous roles have been with the Bribery Act Select Committee, looking at that piece of legislation in the Legislation Office as Parliament representative to the European Union. And for a couple of months, I was on secondment to the UCL Policy Impact Unit, talking to academics about how they can get engaged with Parliament more. So today I'll talk about select committees a bit more and my role specifically, and then go on to how early career researchers can get involved with select committees, as well as tips for giving evidence to select committees. So first of all, you're probably wondering what on earth actually is a clerk. You probably have an image in your head of kind of this Dickensian figure who sits in a dark room with a quilled pen and scribing things down. In a parliamentary context, a clerk is basically a procedural expert. We know about things like the procedure that governs select committees, how bills go through the House, when members can ask questions and how they table questions, and all that sort of thing. So there's a range of offices within both the Commons and the Lords. There's, for example, the Table Office that helps members table and draft questions. The Journal Office that's sort of the procedural research centre. It's a Legislation Office that deals with bills and drafting amendments to private members' bills, and the Committee Office where I am with select committees, and there's also a series of private offices. So in terms of select committees, as well as the other means that you can engage with Parliament, they are mentioned earlier, such as the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. Select committees probably are one of the main ways. So what is the select committee, first of all? In a very literal sense, it is a group of members who've been selected and committed to an issue, hence the select committee. There's normally about 12 members on Commons and Lords select committees, and you do sometimes get joint committees where it's both MPs and Lords. There are slight differences between Commons select committees and Lords select committees, the main one being that Commons select committees look at specific government departments and monitor the ongoing policy of a particular government department. For example, the Commons Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee looks at the DCMS department. The Justice Committee looks at the Ministry of Justice, etc. Whereas Lords committees are more cross-cutting and not necessarily tied to the work of a particular department. So they're designed to complement Commons select committees. And we try and liaise between where we can to make sure that there's not duplication of work between different select committees in the different houses. So I'll take you through the process of how select committees actually go about running an inquiry and how inquiries work. So first of all, there's scoping for a particular topic. So basically, members on a particular select committee will chip in their ideas. Staff will go away and draft some scoping notes for these different ideas and maybe hold a few seminars, normally with academics, on these particular topics. And then the committee, out of these scoping seminars, decide what their favourite is. And then the committee will put out a call for evidence with a selection of questions related to that particular inquiry. And this call for evidence, earlier Claire mentioned written evidence, that's what this is basically. anyone is welcome to respond to the call for evidence. And I mean, unless the piece of evidence basically says something that has already been published or is something extreme, like it's defamatory or something like that, then the committee probably will accept it and may use it in the final report. And to supplement this written evidence, the committee will also run a series of oral evidence sessions where each week there'll be a few witnesses talking about a specific topic within the inquiry, and this will be live and broadcast and transcribed, and the committee will pose a series of questions to the witness panel. At the start of an inquiry, we normally try and get in academics, just because we find academics are particularly good at offering a good overview of a particular topic before we kind of narrow down as the inquiry goes on. Then at the end, staff have the difficult job of putting together and kind of forming a narrative based on, well, for example, the Communications Committee are currently running an inquiry into freedom of expression online. I think we've received over 100 pieces of written evidence and we'll have done, God, probably about 40 witness panels, which when you put it all together is quite a lot of pages. So we then draft a report. The committee looks at the report, we publish the report, and then this is where the report directly feeds into policy making, because the government is bound to respond to the committee's report. They don't have to agree to everything in it, but they have to address each recommendation in it point by point, saying why they accept, partially accept, or reject each recommendation. And then later down the line, there is normally a debate in the chamber about the report, and if the government has responded by that time, then also the government's response. And how this actually feeds into policy isn't always direct. I think often the government likes to be seen to come up with their own ideas rather than necessarily responding to ideas that come from Parliament. So they may not outright acknowledge what has been said, but you may kind of see it feeding into policy a bit further down the line, even if you can't see the sort of direct cause and effect of that. And there are different types of Lords committees. There are sessional committees, which are kind of the permanent committees that look at a broad area of policy like communications and digital. There's special inquiries that are set up for 9 months to look at a specific issue or a specific piece of legislation. And there used to be the EU committee with various subcommittees. And it looks like it will probably still remain, but that is obviously in flux at the moment. So in terms of the staff on a committee, there's the clerk who manages the committee team and advises the committee on parliamentary procedure. There's the policy analyst who does a lot of the policy work, and there's the committee assistant who provides administrative support. And importantly for academics, there's also the specialist advisor. So the specialist advisor is almost universally an academic, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. And they have an expertise in a particular area. So for example, the specialist advisor to the Communications Committee at the moment for the current inquiry is a sociologist at Cambridge who has done research into freedom of expression online. And in terms of how SPADs are recruited, quite often inquiries we're quite pressed for time when setting up an inquiry. So we normally do some research into academics in that particular area and then invite a few in for interviews with the staff and the chair of the committee. And we're much more likely to contact people who already have a link to the committee. So it is really good to form a relationship with staff teams and engage with particular select committees that you think might be relevant to your area of research. and then it kind of puts the onus a bit more on staff, and the staff will think, oh yeah, I had an email or went for a coffee in pre-coronavirus days with this academic. I'll get in touch with them and see if they'd like to come in for an interview for a specialist advisor role. And if there is more time, we may do open recruitment, but that doesn't always take place. And I think one of the key points that we look for in a specialist advisor is simply, can they dedicate the time? We often find that with very, very senior academics who may have lots of other responsibilities, they look great on paper and have lots of experience, but when it comes to it, you actually find that they're not really doing the jobs that a specialist advisor should be doing, which is dedicating maybe around 6 hours a week to committee work. So we're definitely open to early career researchers getting involved as a specialist advisor. And yes, I'd emphasize, just don't be shy with getting involved. Please do contact committee teams, and we're more than happy to have a chat. So I'll speak a bit more on how we can get involved. As mentioned, don't be shy, as well as specialist advisors, which are obviously quite heavy duty in terms of getting involved. There are ways that require less commitment, mainly oral and written evidence to select committees. As mentioned, oral evidence is the series of witnesses that we have running an inquiry, and written evidence is in response to the call for evidence that goes out at the beginning of an inquiry. And as just mentioned, it's again, in terms of getting selected for these, anyone can submit written evidence, but we may solicit written evidence if we feel you could be particularly helpful, and we may solicit you to give oral evidence if we really feel like the committee would like to see your research. So again, it's good to have a relationship with staff. I think a lot of it is just about being on staff's radar. And it's quite difficult for outsiders to actually be aware of the timeframes of inquiries going on. So for that reason, it's really good, because staff will obviously be running these things. They will know when the right time is to contact you, and you will be the first person that pops up in the head if you happen to have been in touch with them previously. And again, just we really value a variety of experience. We approach diversity in quite a broad sense, and there's always a push to try and get more diverse witnesses. And we see kind of early career as a form of diversity versus those more senior academics. And also, if we get in senior professors, they are more likely to be the usual suspects. They are more likely to have seen a few inquiries maybe, and give the same views that they've given at previous ones. So it is good in terms of getting in fresh ideas for the committee to hear from early career researchers. I'd also emphasise that continuous engagement is important. Deciding future witnesses is an ongoing process. We don't just decide it all at the start of an inquiry. And although we do have a deadline for written evidence, we'll normally accept late evidence, especially if it's in reaction to any ongoing developments in the area. And also, staff are always interested in attending conferences, providing we can get there for free, because it is taxpayers' money, and we're not allowed to spend it particularly freely. And then in terms of the evidence, as mentioned, there's oral evidence and written evidence. So I'll give a few tips on exactly what we look for in this evidence. For oral evidence, I'd suggest the three things are the 3 C's, although it is completely coincidental, they all begin with C, but there's clarity, confidence, and collaboration. So first of all, clarity. As mentioned by Claire earlier, our reports are aimed at both the public and experts. Therefore, you're more likely to get quoted in them if you try and use as much lay terminology as possible and avoid technical language. However, we also appreciate that technical language has a legitimate use within academia, and therefore, if you do need to use it, it's helpful if you can make it clear exactly what you mean by a particular technical term. In evidence, we don't really want to hear a history of a subject, and we don't need to hear both sides of the story. We simply want the academic's views clearly expressed. And please do speak candidly. This makes it more fun and much more quotable. And you don't necessarily have to play up to members at oral evidence sessions. Please do challenge them if you think they're on the wrong lines. It's also very helpful if you can make meaningful, practical policy recommendations, because that is ultimately what the report is about. And finally, as mentioned, we're happy to accept supplementary written evidence a bit further down the line if there's anything else you think of. And then confidence. We find that some witnesses don't project the confidence that their expertise would justify, but you've been invited in. We have complete confidence that you should be confident, so please do be. And the committee almost always treats academics as non-hostile, in inverted commas, witnesses. While there may be a bit of grilling, especially by members with expertise in the area, the committee genuinely want to learn from academics' experience. We often find that, some academics, God forbid, may not have heard of select committees, but we always want to emphasise that it is very good for career development and, of course, the ultimate goal of influencing government policy. And there's also other factors at play. Sessions often get media attention, and they're very good for raising an issue's profile. And if you do appear on a witness panel, please do challenge the view of other panelists. We want a discussion to take place. And although we'll be confident that you have enough to say about the area, if you really do feel it's not your area, it's always helpful for you to refer us to a colleague. And then finally, collaboration. If you do give oral evidence, it's not a soapbox. Evidence can be very good in substance, but poor as a contribution. Everyone on the panel should be given a chance to speak. Otherwise, well, we don't get to hear from everyone, and the committee will be less likely to see your evidence in a favourable light. But do feel free to discuss the session with other panelists before, as this may avoid any duplication at the session and also forewarns the panelists of any areas of disagreement, and also may reduce your own anxiety about appearing before a select committee. And then I'll just run through what we look for in written evidence. This will be in response to the call for evidence that goes out. Please do challenge the premises of the questions. While the policy analyst on a particular committee is normally an expert in the area, they don't have the time to dedicate or the research to put in that an academic does. So if you feel that one of them is we're asking the wrong questions, please do tell us. And as mentioned, please do try and make the written evidence deadline, but staff do appreciate that the academic may only have just become aware of the inquiry, so we will consider late submissions. Submissions to short and to the point are always very helpful. Should be clearly formatted with a date, paragraph number, clear headings. And also it's really important that you think about what you can contribute that others may not be able to. What is your niche and what can you contribute to the inquiry? And as mentioned, please don't submit something which has been published elsewhere. For example, don't just resubmit an academic paper that you've published because this can't be accepted. And likewise, don't publish your evidence until it's been accepted by the committee. The evidence should explicitly be in response to the call for evidence rather than anything else you've published. However, in the evidence, you may quote or cite any published material. So I think that's everything I wanted to go through. Hopefully that provides you with lots of material for getting engaged with select committees. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Alistair. Just an amazing insight from that perspective that we normally, particularly in the research world, don't get an opportunity to to hear from. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And just a reminder to people, if you've got questions, please do put them in the Q&A box as we move forward. Great. So we'll now move on to our final speaker, who again I'm really thrilled to have with us today, to give again quite a different perspective. So it's Dr. Brynn Lloyd Evans, who's an associate professor in the Division of Psychiatry at University College London, and is Deputy Director of the NIHR Mental Health Policy Research Unit. And he's going to talk to us a bit about that unit and his personal reflections on his involvement in policy. So thank you so much, Brynn. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Helen, and hi, everybody. Hi. So I haven't pitched this talk specifically for early career researchers, I'm afraid, but I think hopefully a lot of it, I think, will be relevant for whatever stage in our careers we may be, and it'll also hopefully just give a sort of view of things to bear in mind as you go through your career. But what I'd like to do is just to sort of start off by acknowledging that there are sort of challenges to influencing policy and practice. And a first one there, which is quite fundamental, is just most mental health trials have negative results, which, while they can still be scientifically important, are not so helpful for policymakers who are thinking, how do we improve service provision right now? So I suppose a really kind of fundamental thing for all of us is to do sort of good quality research and have well-designed kind of interventions that then work, which are going to be of more interest to policymakers. So that's a kind of the fundamentals of doing good research don't go away kind of thing. There are sort of structural problems, I think, for the way research is funded. So the way that treatment costs are funded during research projects means that kind of new intervention is likely to end at the end of a trial or a research project, however successful it was, and that inevitably kind of ups the implementation gap. Turnover amongst sort of civil servants and politicians. So certainly sort of civil servants I've cultivated relationships with have been sort of seconded off to deal with first Brexit and then COVID, which doesn't make it easier to sort of keep those relationships going, but that's something we live with. And of course, our areas of research may not fit entirely with current policy programs. And I think sort of Ben's advice about trying to sort of make that fit as good as you can is good. And themed research calls are obviously one good lever that the government uses to get research on things that they're of interest to. So they're obviously kind of useful for us as researchers to bear in mind as well. And my next slide was going to be about what do we already know about what can help, but I see that Ben's already talked about this really nice paper by Oliver and colleagues, which I would recommend you have a look at. So I won't go back through all their kind of suggestions for what helps, but I suppose just the thing to point out is that most of these about developing relationships, getting your research out on time, making it accessible, having specific recommendations for policy are within our gift as researchers to do something about that. And I think we are, as a sort of profession, getting better at thinking that that's part of our job, but it really should be if we want our work to have an impact. One thing I'd like to say, just a general thing, and partly in response to the question from Katja in the chat, so a lot of the focus today has been on kind of getting the ear of politicians, hasn't it, I think, and how that can work. I have to say that my experience of kind of working with policymakers has been that it's been sort of civil servants and administrators have been most of the people that I've talked to at any length. And I haven't got a slide, I'm afraid, but in terms of the sort of healthcare and the sort of structures by which policy is made and put into place, while kind of high-level policy aims and strategies will come from government ministers and be initiated by politicians, the process of kind of putting that into place and implementing it, and quality assurance in healthcare, and sort of actually just getting new initiatives going. So for instance, government-sponsored pilot schemes are generally done by either civil servants in the Department of Health and Social Care, or more typically by arm's length bodies. So by bodies such as NHS England or Public Health England or the Care Quality Commission for kind of quality assurance. And I would sort of really suggest that kind of officials working within those bodies are kind of really good sources of developing relationships as well. So they're often the people who are writing policy guidance or having contact with services across the country to sort of, whether it's setting key performance indicators or giving guidance about what should happen. And they also have the ear of ministers. So that's a sort of another route in. What I'm going to do today is just give two sort of quick examples of engaging with policymakers, which will hopefully sort of illustrate a couple of key themes. So one of them is kind of be persistent. So I think, again, Ben and Viv were talking about kind of needing to remain positive and resilient. And I think kind of just not expecting necessarily quick wins in terms of your kind of influence on policy, but being persistent, I think, is one really important thing. And the second one about being responsive. And in that one, I'll introduce a little bit about the Mental Health Policy Research Unit. So the first example really is just talking about sort of work that we've done in the research group, which I'm part of at UCL on mental health crisis care. And just to sort of set the scene that really this is about sort of 20 years of a body of research, which a number of us in the department have worked on really. So I suppose a few things there are kind of, being part of a collaborative will perhaps increase your kind of power and your ability to get a body of research done, which can influence policy, and play a long game as well would be other things. So this program of work has involved 3 trials, a number of naturalistic studies and mixed methods studies as well, and more recently some sort of work at sort of systems level within the policy research unit. And a few ways in which we've had impact from that piece of work. Well, the top one here, I suppose, is the traditional way, really. So this is how researchers have typically thought about getting impact, isn't it? You do your trial, hopefully you get a positive result from it, and then it gets into a clinical guideline, like NICE guidelines. And that's not a bad way still of having some policy influence in your research about doing kind of really robust research, which gets positive findings. But more recently, we've, I think, influenced policy in other ways. And a couple of those are really working very closely with officials in NHS England, and particularly the leads of the mental health crisis care section there, who are kind of mid-level civil servants, I suppose, and perhaps a bit more approachable or easier to access than some of these kind of very important ministers or whoever. And I think some of the things that have helped us have influence are to have a kind of relationship with them. So as Ben was saying, sort of getting in at the beginning, so that they know the work we're doing, and as our findings come in, they can be sort of fed into policy straight away. So a few things that we've managed to do there, we developed a sort of fidelity scale for crisis home treatment teams, which is kind of a model of good practice. And we work very closely with the NHS England team to think about how some of those fidelity criteria could be turned into kind of easily collectible key performance indicators that are now being collected annually in an audit by NHS England for services across the country. So that's a sort of fairly kind of clear way in which it's influencing practice nationally. And then other things that have been helpful in here is that our work on kind of that high fidelity crisis teams had better outcomes in terms of reducing admissions was used by NHS England to make a pitch for the comprehensive spending review and get more funding for mental health crisis care. And that felt like a really sort of satisfying thing that we felt we'd contributed to sort of something very tangible happening then that was of benefit for services. I suppose just we're focusing on working with policymakers in the UK, aren't we? But just to sort of say that of course you can have sort of an international reach as well. And the last point here is at a more local level, I suppose, is trying to sort of overcome this problem about everything stopping at the end of a research study. And in one project, which was about sort of developing a peer-supported self-management program to supplement routine crisis care, we work quite closely with some of the teams there to sort of sustain that in 5 of the 6 sites and help them make a pitch for sort of funding for that at a local level as well. So those are a few of the kind of impacts from that program. What helps? Well, here's a kind of few things, and some of this will be familiar from the talks we've had before. So be patient. I've pinched some of these slides from my colleague Sonia Johnson, who's going to talk like this, and she's called this opportunism. But I guess one way of saying this is that a lot of the work we've done has been evaluating things that are out there in care already, rather than completely sort of new ideas. And I think that helps it be immediately relevant for policy. So sort of health services research is kind of good stuff for policymakers. I think it's a good fit. Being proactive, I think this is the kind of key one really, about trying to contact key policy staff. And that gets easier over time as you develop relationships, because once you know someone, they can put you in touch with other people who are helpful. So I think if you're kind of thinking you don't know where to start, one bit of advice would be to just talk to some senior colleagues, and certainly talking to colleagues if you're at King's or UCL in the Mental Health Policy Research Unit would be a kind of one way of trying to get an in with someone who might be, if not the right person, able to signpost you to somebody who is. Be tolerant that you not everything you do will sort of hit home, so you have to sort of be a bit to live with uncertainty about what influence you may be having for a bit. I think engaging with kind of people who make policy at local level is also really helpful for getting things done. And if you have some links within your local trust, that is not necessarily a bad place to sort of make links and try and get your work into practice. Hanging around on Twitter, this is a bullet point I've borrowed from the previous presentation. Anyone who knows me will know that I'm a social media refusenik, but I think that is to my detriment. And luckily I've got colleagues who are better at looking at social media. And I think certainly a lot of civil servants and politicians engage that way, and it is a really good way to get people's attention. Last bullet point here, it can be reassuring to ask policymakers if you've influenced them, but also to check out what they need. And that bit about getting a dialogue and sort of working out what might be helpful next steps is useful, I think. Okay, now I'd just like to talk a little bit and have a second example from this NIHR Mental Health Policy Research Unit, which takes up quite a lot of my time now. So there have been policy research units in a whole range of areas of kind of health. But the mental health one we got for the first time in 2017, and it's been commissioned for a 5-year period. So this is an initiative commissioned by government to try and strengthen the links between research and policy, and really to have a kind of research resource on tap for policymakers. So what we do in that, I'm going to call it the PRU, which is the jargon we use, is really do sort of, in research terms, fairly rapid projects, so short to medium term projects, which are going to be useful for policymakers. And to that end, our kind of programme is worked out collaboratively with the Department of Health and Social Care and NHS England and the other arm's length bodies, and they have the final say on what we do. We do include a rapid response function, so a civil servant or a minister can get in touch and say, I'd like a sort of summary, or I want to talk to an expert this afternoon or in a couple of days' time. And that hasn't happened too often, mercifully, but we've provided that where necessary. So I think that kind of hitting the moment when your research is going to be useful is quite important. We've got a core research staff at UCL and King's and a wider network of collaborators across the country. And typically we don't do sort of substantial primary data collection. So the PRU doesn't do trials basically that are going to take several years to come to a result. But we do quite a lot of evidence synthesis, economic modelling, using routine data that's already available, or kind of rapid surveys or qualitative data collection. And when we were set up in late 2017, that coincided almost exactly with the Theresa May's announcement at the Tory party conference that they were going to set up an independent review of the Mental Health Act. So that gave us a sort of pretty immediate challenge for trying to sort of put into practice what we said we'd do about providing evidence to support policy making in government, and in this case at one remove through this independent review of the Mental Health Act. And I think we did achieve that by doing these kind of 9 pieces of work really rapidly with a big team over 9 publications. And we involved an awful lot of PhD students and postdocs and early career researchers to get this work done at speed. So hopefully that was a kind of introduction to some sort of very policy relevant research for people in our teams. Found a lot of things that are useful. I'm going to skip over this slide to get to the kind of what did we learn about what helped. So I think we did have some impacts there. That the Mental Health Act review report included a 40-page research summary of the work here, which was kind of, I think, more detail than normally is included. And that's now been translated into a white paper. And it also led to a sort of themed NIHR call for research on the Mental Health Act because of some of the research gaps that we'd highlighted in our work. So I think there were 2 sorts of things that helped here. One were kind of structures within the Mental Health Policy Research Unit. And first of all, the kind of thing is the idea about what we're trying to do, about being set up to do rapid research and not very long-term, lengthy research projects. That business about how do you find out who you need to talk to in government and how do you make those links has been made easier for us by having a kind of manager in the Department of Health and Social Care in the Science Research and Evidence Directorate. So Alison Tingle is our kind of main contact there, who helps put us in touch with the people we need to talk to who have got a kind of ask for policy research. I think the kind of what we've had to do in order to do this work is to give up a degree of control. So whereas in a research study where you've put in the bid for funding and then you do the research, you have a lot of control over what happens. Here we have to develop our work programme very collaboratively to meet the needs of policymakers and be prepared to change it as well. So in 2020, we dropped most of what we were doing and put it all on hold in order to do research about the mental health impacts of COVID and the pandemic. We're set up with a really large contingency fund to allow us to sort of be flexible, which is again a luxury that most researchers don't have. So some things there that are structurally helpful, but I think things we've tried to do as well, and this will follow quite a lot, I think, of what both Claire and Ben and Viv and Alistair have been saying as well. So we've not just published papers, we've tried to have stakeholder events that are publicly available with a real policy focus. So with questions about what are the implications for practice and policy, what needs to happen next, and so on. And I think one thing that's really helped us to do that is not to sort of think that we have to do it all ourselves or know how to do it. So we've created links with experts who know about this. So the Centre for Mental Health have really helped us kind of, for instance, make kind of policy briefings which are kind of clear and accessible and succinct. So that kind of writing for intelligent non-specialists that Claire was talking about. And we've used the mental health to really help us with kind of comms and social media in a public facing response. I think another point that Claire made is that policymakers value a whole range of evidence and they don't just need a kind of a published paper. So they value stakeholder input. And to that end, we've tried to sort of involve our lived experience group a lot. And one initiative that we've had has been for all our published papers have now included a 300-word lived experience commentary from a sort of personal perspective from a couple of our lived experience colleagues. And that I think is quite hits home to policymakers and hopefully is helpful. Get your work out there. So don't just publish a few high impact papers, get your papers out as quickly as you can and use preprint so that you've got something to share as early as possible. Social media remains helpful as a way to sort of make links and to publicize your work. And I think one thing we've tried to do in the Mental Health Policy Research Unit is to act as a bit of a conduit between policymakers and the wider research community. So that can be in response to a need. If policymakers get in touch with us and say they want to know something and we don't have the expertise in our team, we can try and find it. But I think we'd also be really open to sort of, especially if it's connected to a sort of program of work we're doing, for researchers to sort of get in touch and either ask us, this is what I'm doing, who might I get in touch with? And if we can help, we will, or to help sort of publicize research. So that's a sort of potential avenue that people can use as well. I think that's probably enough for me and give us a bit of time to sort of have a chat about things you're interested in. But thanks for listening and I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brynn, and absolutely really useful to think about all those other types of policymakers. We have, focused quite a bit on the kind of national governments and devolved institutions, but there are, so many people locally and particularly in mental health and health more broadly that people will want to engage with as well. So thank you so much. So I will get our speakers, if they don't mind putting their cameras on, to join us for this last sort of 10 minutes to answer some questions from the audience. So if people have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. We've got a few already, so I will start to field some of those. So we had one that was quite specific for Ben and Viv, around thinking about some of those tools you talked about, slide decks and policy briefing notes, etc. How do people go about sharing them? How do they get them to the right people?
Viv, do you want to handle this one because you've been doing it recently?
Sure. I guess like with slide decks, we have a in-house communications officer who has a list of all of the best people to communicate with. I guess that's a benefit of working with the Policy Institute is we have established connections already. We know who the right people in media are. We know how to get this on the desks of the stakeholders or the right people in government. If you're doing it yourself, I think it can be a bit difficult to try and figure that out. It's sort of going through and figuring out who is on what committees and which ones would be most related to the policy that you're looking at. That would be my answer to that one. Ben, you might want to add something though.
Thanks, Viv. I mean, I think there's another question in the Q&A which links into that, which is how do you identify the right people? And I think that's a really good is a really good question. I mean, as you say, Viv, we're lucky in the Institute, we've built up this over time, but I guess the way we started it when we kicked off in 2013 and there were just two of us was for each area we began looking at, we did what we call a Pestle Analysis, which is something else we teach in another session, but essentially you just look down, Pestle stands for politics, economics, society, technology, law and environment. And if you look across all of these areas and you think about how that relates to your research question, you can identify a whole set of stakeholders quite quickly. And we just, started building up a list basically. And we started with 5 people and then it became 25 and got people to introduce it to people. And I think this is actually the most daunting bit is sending the first email. And in the course that we do, which is like a 2-day long course about communicating with policymakers, we end on it getting everyone to email one person with a request to have a chat. And it doesn't really matter who it is, it's just getting over that first hurdle. So if I had another sort of top tip and a key message today, it's send that first email, because I've never yet heard of a policymaker coming back saying, why on earth are you getting in touch with me? I've only ever heard of them saying, I'm really sorry, I'm really busy at the moment, I will come to this shortly. That's the worst I've ever heard. But more often than not, actually the opposite experience. People get, warmly welcomed, thanks for, sending this over and so on. I think that is my, big learning is actually, it's not as a scary thing as you might think. And, try and identify someone to email and then do it, because you'll find that it snowballs really quickly and you'll be in demand management rather than the opposite.
Alistair, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, I was just going to kind of re-emphasize the point that Ben made. Don't be shy, there is absolutely nothing you can lose by emailing. And also just to address a couple of the kind of more specific points in the question in terms of whether to go for members or staff. I'd basically universally say staff. I'm fortunate in the chair to the Communications Committee is particularly good at forwarding on emails to me from anyone who gets in touch, but they're much more likely to get picked up if you email staff on committees or party parliamentary groups. And in terms of kind of identifying which of those, because the remits are kind of quite clearly defined, especially with select committees and APPGs, if you just get a list of all the Commons ones, all the Lords ones, and all the APPGs which are across both chambers, then hopefully you should be able to kind of see which ones to get in touch with. There are kind of occasional policy issues that fall between the gaps of select committees. But I mean, there's no harm getting in touch with multiple select committees if you think that if you're not entirely sure. Again, if it's the wrong committee, they can just go, sorry, I can't help you, but I can refer you to my colleague on this committee who can.
Great, thank you. And I think, Brynn, you've also touched on quite a few of those points as well. And it sounds like having contacts in particular organisations and working through policy units such as the mental health one, but also the policy institutes is helpful. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
I suppose just to echo again what Ben was saying, that my experience has been universally positive, that people are often sort of surprisingly keen and grateful even, and just say, oh, it's really nice that you've got in touch. And that's been, at worst, people are going to ignore you, which is kind of not the end of the world, is it really? So I agree, be brave. But, there are a few sources of advice which we're saying to do. If you've got no idea where to start, then talk to colleagues or talk to Policy Institute or POU or something like that to get a bit of help with signposting.
Great, thank you. So other questions, one asking, given that, yes, this is going to take quite a bit of time and thought, and it is certainly useful to have policy institutes and units around to help you, is it likely that only Russell Group or well-funded universities can have impact and to be able to put in the extra effort? I mean, I think we've heard from quite a few of you, there are lots of different ways to do that, but I don't know if anyone wants to address some of that question, Ben.
Yeah, I really wanted to pick this one up. So when the Policy Institute was founded, we started off a network called the Universities Policy Engagement Network. And in 2014, there were 6 of us. I think there are now 79 universities in it, and all 79 of those have things like the Policy Institute, and they range from Cambridge and Oxford and King's and Russell Group universities, all the way to much smaller universities. Every university is investing in this. There are real financial incentives. I don't think that Russell Group have a huge advantage, and actually a lot of the smaller universities have very local questions that they're really interested in, and they put lots and lots of time and effort in. And I'd really strongly encourage you to get in touch with the UPenn network. It's really good, and they're very well plugged into Post as well. So it's definitely not just a Russell Group thing. There's a whole set of people doing it, and they're really good. If people want more details on that, drop me a note and I can put you in touch.
Great, and maybe Ben, you could, or Viv could put the link to the pen in the chat if you have a chance. That would be great. And there was another question. Oh, I'm in the wrong one now. About any advice that anyone has to recommend for undergraduate students who are thinking of starting a career in policy. So perhaps before they've got a master's degree or anything else, are there things they could do very early to help them with a career in that direction? Anyone want to? I don't know, Alistair, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
You've obviously done an undergraduate degree and then gone into policy. Were there particular things you thought were helpful, or other people you know have done that have helped them to get into a policy job?
Yeah, I was just kind of giving it some thought. I think I did a master's, but not policy related. My undergraduate was history and my master's was modern British history. So neither of them really policy related at all. I'd say it's good to kind of get a little bit of maybe political or policy experience under your belt before you apply. And obviously there is the perennial problem of unpaid internships and all of this kind of stuff. But if you can get one or two, they do help. And I think things are much easier now than they used to be, simply because everything's virtual at the moment. And therefore, at least you don't have the kind of, again, perennial problem of everything being in London, which doesn't help at all. And in my instance, and also definitely with the civil service, the graduate recruitment programs, which I got in through the parliamentary one, and the civil service run their own, they of course don't expect massive prior knowledge before applying to them. With mine, I didn't have to know anything about how Parliament works or anything like that. A lot of it was competency based. So I'd recommend going for those. They're both good routes in. And I know that quite a lot of think tanks and consultancies have kind of entry level roles as well that are really good for starting off.
Brilliant, thank you. I guess also people can think about local councils and NHS trusts and all sorts of other things. Brynn, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I suppose one thing that maybe speaks to both of those questions a little bit is just not to overlook that kind of lots of voluntary sector organisations and charities have really, really good links with policymakers as well, and are just very skilled at kind of lobbying as well. So, and will also do things like briefings and position statements and very rapid surveys and bits of research to sort of influence specific calls. So they're a kind of good link into research as well. And if you feed into work that's going on with an organisation there, it can be a useful way in. And it's potentially ways to kind of volunteer or get a taste or a look at kind of what's going on as well. So that may be useful.
Incredibly useful, thank you. So I'm conscious we're almost at time. So I want to just say a huge thank you to our fabulous speakers, and Claire, who was also not able to stay with us for this bit, but thank you all so much for giving up your time today and giving us really quite different perspectives on engaging with policy. So thank you so much. I'm going to give you my own clap as everyone else can't unmute, but thank you so much. Just a reminder in the chat, and Julie will post it again, is a link to a really quick survey to let us know what you've learned from today and your thoughts on how it's been and if it's been helpful for you. I hope it has. I've also put in the link to the VAMHN website where we will have the slides, the recording, and also you can check out the other sessions that we've got in this UKRI Mental Health Network's Lunchtime series. Our next one is on the 12th of May at 12, and we're going to be looking at juggling commitments, one of which might be trying to influence policy amongst the many other things that people in research are trying to do. So please do join us for that. And again, a huge thank you to everybody for their fantastic talks. Great. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye.